Chapter 1. A Man of Conviction. Craig Stephen Wright was born on October 23, 1970 in Chermside, a suburb of Brisbane, Australia, the middle child of three. The Wrights were a Catholic family, with Craig growing up alongside his older sister Lisa and his younger sister Danielle, with half-sisters entering his life in later years. Their neighborhood was populated by people Wright later classed as, quote, absolutely poor white trash, and where, quote, half the people I knew were now drug dealers or bikie members. Wright seemed to have a good relationship with Danielle, but in 2019 he likened his relationship with Lisa to oil, water, petrol, and a match. Lisa, in turn, has distanced herself from Craig and his activities, despite the pair both working in the cryptocurrency sector. If this relationship was combustible, then the relationship between the entire family and its patriarch, Frederick, was a forest fire. Wright says that Frederick, a Vietnam War veteran, was a changed man when he returned from the conflict, turning to drinking and becoming verbally and then physically abusive to the children's mother, Julie Archer, abuse which soon extended to the children. Indeed, a 2020 psychological report on Wright alluded to these experiences. Dr. Wright and his siblings were exposed to and experienced traumatizing events attributed to his biological father and subsequently to one of his stepfathers. Wright told author Andrew O'Hagan for a piece called The Satoshi Affair, published in June 2016, that he was never admired by his father, who made the young Wright feel like he was, quote, never fucking good enough. This sentiment allegedly played a part in the date Wright chose to release the Bitcoin white paper in 2008, as he tweeted on its 15th anniversary. My father told me I would never succeed. 31st of October is his birthday. Now you know why I released Bitcoin that day. Happy birthday, Dad. F you. Wright's decision to memorialize his abusive father over his loving mother, who Wright once called an amazing woman, was almost certainly a misguided attempt to capitalize on a coincidence. It also doesn't check out. The Bitcoin white paper was released on 31st of October 2008 at 2:10 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, which would have been 5:10 a.m. on November 1st in Sydney. Wright had already addressed this 3 years before the aforementioned tweet, where we encounter the first case of him rewriting history. The Bitcoin white paper was not published on October 31st, 2008, as many falsely suppose. For a start, it was distributed and not published, and in fact had been sent or distributed to a number of other people prior to this date. More importantly, it was in fact sent on November 1st, 2008. It could have been sent earlier, but I was still working at BDO. Frederick and Julie divorced when Wright was 5, with Julie keeping the 3 children. However, in line with the repressive attitudes of the Catholic religion, the foursome was ostracized by their local church and the community, making life even tougher. This ostracism left Wright with a chip on his shoulder, as he told O'Hagan, but the impact may have been more severe. Dr. Ami Clean, the author of Wright's psychological report, opined that Wright's childhood trauma left him with a burning desire to succeed and a craving for public recognition from a young age. This has undoubtedly played out in Wright's adult life, with many assigning his pursuit of wealth and desire for dominion over the entire crypto space to this facet of his personality. As we will see, however, this drive to be perceived as rich, highly successful, and supremely intelligent led to Wright taking shortcuts that have left him with a criminal conviction and owing hundreds of millions of dollars in legal settlements and bills, with the prospect of more to come. The only recognition he has received outside his curated bubble of supporters is as a serial fraudster and incompetent evidence forger. Julie was forced to work multiple jobs in order to keep the family afloat, leading to Wright spending, quote, 6 days out of 7 with his maternal grandfather, Ronald Lynham. Ronald's son, Donald, described his father and how his interests impacted Wright in a 2020 deposition for the Kleiman v. Wright case. My father was a radio engineer, and so he had a whole lot of technical paraphernalia there, which Craig found absolutely intriguing, and he spent all the time he could with his grandfather. During their many hours together, Wright got hands-on experience with radios and telecom equipment in Ronald's workshop, and it was Ronald who introduced Wright to Japanese culture, a fascination that grew with age, leading to Wright wearing samurai clothes out in public and learning karate, judo, and ninjutsu. During the Copa v. Wright trial in 2024, Danielle vividly retold an episode from their youth where she and some friends were frightened away from a park by a man dressed as a ninja and performing related moves, which turned out to be Craig Wright. Indeed, Dr. Clean told in his report how Wright, quote, could be observed at the playground alone, dressed as a ninja and playing as if he were the weirdest person in the world. It was Donald, however, who would have had the biggest impact on Wright, growing into a father figure for the youngster, who was enthralled by his uncle's position as wing commander in the Royal Australian Air Force, the RAAF. In The Satoshi Affair, which blew Wright's Satoshi claims wide open when it was published, Julie admitted that as a child, Wright had a, quote, long-standing habit of adding bits onto the truth, just to make it bigger. Andrew O'Hagan, who spent 7 months in Wright's orbit for the piece, recognized something of this during their time together. In what he said, he often went further than he needed to, further than he ought to have done. He appeared to start with the truth, and then slowly he would inflate his part until the whole story suddenly looked weak. Justice Meller made a similar observation in his Copa v. Wright ruling. It is sometimes said that a good lie contains a kernel of truth. In my judgment, on many and frequent occasions, Dr. Wright adhered to this proposition. I sensed there was often something in his answer which was true, but the answer as a whole was a plain lie, or not an answer to the question put. We have seen dozens of examples of this over the years, but a very vivid one relates to Wright's purported reading prowess. In 2019, Wright boasted to his followers that he had read 15,500 books up to that point, which equates to more than 1 book per day for every day of his life from the age of 4. Not satisfied with such a Herculean task, Wright went further, claiming that he was able to remember the text on the pages of the books he had read, too. 2 years later, Wright augmented this incredible claim by stating in an interview to have read 2,400 books in 2020 alone, an average of 6.5 per day. When asked how this was possible, Wright told the interviewer, "I read very fast, and some books are smaller than others." In that same interview, Wright claimed that when he wasn't reading, he was busy writing, clocking up almost 3 million words in the same time frame, equating to more than 8,000 per day, thanks in large part to the 20-plus degrees he claimed to be studying simultaneously. All this was accomplished while carrying out his duties as chief scientist of the British blockchain company InChain. It's safe to say that Wright's critics are not convinced of this achievement. Wright attended Everton Park State High School in North Brisbane between the ages of 13 and 15, where he, quote, topped the state in Australian math and physics tests. However, his mother moved him to the nearby Padua College because, in Wright's words, he, quote, had other problems and the school had difficulty with me. It was here, Wright says, that he was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. In Padua College, when I started having problems, they saw how I was doing in math and couldn't understand, so the school psychologist had me tested and told me I had Asperger's. To assess this claim, we have to do some brief time hopping. Wright made this statement during the Kleiman v. Wright trial in 2021, 5 years after he and his family had discussed Wright's past with Andrew O'Hagan for the Satoshi Affair, conversations which included Wright's apparent neurodivergence. However, there are no mentions in O'Hagan's piece of any such diagnosis or even a hint of one. 3 years later, in a June 2019 deposition for the Kleiman v. Wright case, Wright claimed, quote, I'm actually autistic, and I have what most people commonly mislabel as Asperger's, though I'm high-functioning. If Wright thought the Padua school psychologist had misdiagnosed him, he didn't say so, once again neglecting to mention the alleged diagnosis. 9 months later, Dr. Clean was asked to assess Wright for autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, specifically for the Kleiman v. Wright case, where Wright would almost certainly have told him about the Padua College diagnosis. Dr. Clean diagnosed Wright with ASD, but not once in his extensive report which detailed Wright's behavioral difficulties and differences in childhood and young adulthood did he report Wright claiming to have had a prior diagnosis of ASD or Asperger's. Only after Dr. Clean's diagnosis in April 2020 did Wright come out with the Padua College story. Wright says that he moved colleges again at 16, this time to the Brisbane College of Advanced Education. Here he says he attained his first degree, a Bachelor of Applied Science in Discrete Mathematics, in 1987, claiming that he was 16 years old for most of it, before graduating at 17. However, this achievement is entirely absent in the earliest formal record of Wright's education, his military record, where he is recorded as attending Everton Park between 1983 and 1985, and Padua College between 1986 and 87, the latter of which saw him complete his high school education only. Wright's military record does not mention the Brisbane College of Advanced Education or his alleged degree, which are also absent from the education section of his LinkedIn profile. Of all people, Craig Wright would not have passed up the opportunity to crow about this achievement were it true. In 2025, Wright boasted about his hardship and academic prowess at this tender age. I went to shit schools, not 1 or 2, 11 schools before I made it out of year 12. Year 12 I barely blinked at. I was already in university before the rest of them knew how to write a coherent paragraph. While they were prepping for exams, I was already tearing through first-year law and reading Wittgenstein for sport. There is no evidence of Wright attending so many schools during this period, however, while his university studies began in 1988, the same year as his contemporaries. Wright was inducted into the Australian Air Force Cadets at 15, following in Don Lindman's footsteps by applying to the Australian Defence Force Academy to train as a pilot the year after. But he was rejected for unspecified reasons. Perhaps tellingly, the mandatory psychologist's report, which should have appeared in Wright's file, was replaced with a blank sheet of paper. Nevertheless, Wright maintained during the Kleiman v. Wright trial that at this tender age he helped redesign a parts database for the F-111s for the RAAF because he, quote, had family there. Wright was a busy boy in 1985. Alongside his studies and his database work for the RAAF, he allegedly worked in the IT department of the Australian department store Kmart and embarked on his coding journey, as he relayed in 2023. My fascination with coding and computing began when I dabbled with C and C++ around the age of 8 or 9. By age 11, I had already started writing code for games. I used C and C++ because they were the languages that games were written in. This sequence of events is impossible, however, because C++ wasn't released to the public until Wright was 15. When he was challenged over this during the Copa v. Wright trial, Wright insisted that he was talking about precursor languages, not C++ itself. But Justice Meller ruled that Wright's explanations were, quote, either wholly or partially fabricated on the matter. Wright must have been a proficient coder as well as a time-traveling one. He claimed to have sold his first video game just a year after first experimenting with computer languages before working for a game developer called Thermonuclear War Games. Wright expanded on this in an interview for CoinGeek TV in 2021. I was a code tester for Buckaroo Banzai. A horrible movie came out of it too. There was also Kangaroo Jack, but that was also horrible. I have this habit where any game I was involved in was horrible. This story was augmented 3 weeks later when Wright told his followers that in the 1980s he had been, quote, on a team of a company EA Games took over, and added that he was mentioned in the credits of the game. However, this is almost certainly not true. Kangaroo Jack wasn't released until 2003 and was developed by Tantalus Interactive, not Thermonuclear War Games, while Buckaroo Banzai, released in 1983, was created by Florida-based developer Adventure International. Adventure International founder Scott Adams explained in an email to a source that the idea of his company utilizing the services of a 13-year-old Australian boy to help code the game was improbable. The name Craig Wright is not familiar to me. The Buckaroo adventure game was done in-house by a number of my employees, and I oversaw the effort at the time. Wright enrolled at the University of Queensland in 1988, where he studied for a joint degree in electrical engineering and a Bachelor of Science in computer science. If he was, quote, tearing through first-year law, therefore, he was doing it in his own time. He held down 2 jobs to financially support himself at this time, one of which was gutting chickens. However, Wright dropped out of this course in 1992 on medical grounds, having discovered a melanoma on his back for which he underwent treatment. Wright says that the melanoma was at stage 4 when it was caught, telling an interviewer in 2020 that he was given 3 months to live if he didn't start treatment immediately. Indeed, at stage 4, the cancer would have spread beyond the original site and into lymph nodes and internal organs, giving him around a 22% chance of survival, according to the website curemelanoma.org. However, Julie Archer appears to have played down the illness to Andrew O'Hagan, saying, "This was after he got out of the Air Force, and when he recovered, he was off to university." Wright claims that he discovered the melanoma while with the RAAF, which clashes with his 1989 reapplication, where he was accepted into a 9-year officership program to study electrical engineering, beginning his first semester in 1990 as an officer cadet. Wright's records show that he passed one class, Law of War, and didn't pass any engineering or math classes, although there is the chance, as we saw with his rejected pilot's application, that these records are incomplete. Wright was again released on medical grounds 7 months into his course, having completed, but apparently failed, a lone semester. In 1996, Wright claimed that this release was due to a, quote, conflict of interests. Wright says that after his release from the RAAF, he, quote, earned money by doing whatever I could get, including working in a petrol station, while still studying at the University of Queensland. In the mid-1990s, Wright became a member of the cypherpunk movement, the growing online community of libertarians who were using the advent of the internet to further their battle for privacy. In fact, in 2019, Wright claimed not just to have used the fulcrum of this movement, the cypherpunks mailing list, on a regular basis, but to have been one of the first people to do so, a claim that is easy to make but impossible to verify. The cypherpunk movement defended freedom of expression, access to information, and privacy as basic rights that should be protected and promoted by technology and cryptography, something that was quickly becoming a reality rather than just a theory, thanks to the introduction of the internet into homes around the world. This group of libertarians spawned several attempts at a decentralized currency, including David Chaum's DigiCash, Wei Dai's B-Money, and Nick Szabo's BitGold, all of which had either failed on launch or remained simply theoretical in nature. Wright engaged in discussions on the cypherpunks mailing list, but left after less than a month because he, quote, couldn't stand people like Julian Assange and their ultra-libertarian views. Wright has since claimed that Bitcoin's creation had nothing to do with the cypherpunk movement, a claim we will assess soon. Around the time he was trying and failing to ingratiate himself into the cypherpunk world, Wright began chatting online with Carol Lynn Black, then a nursing manager at a military hospital in Ottawa, Canada. The pair hit it off right away, despite an 18-year age gap, and Wright proposed to the 44-year-old just 6 weeks later. To Andrew O'Hagan, Lynn said that Wright always has to be the best, adding that he stepped on people and left bodies by the wayside in order to get what he wanted. This, she said, was down to his, quote, very sociopathic personality, something that Wright would come to demonstrate during their coupledom and in the years after its termination. Craig and Lynn married the same year, with Lynn moving to Australia shortly afterwards and beginning a new life as Mrs. Wright. 1996 also saw Craig create his first 2 companies, Vinda la Terre Pty Ltd, on June 9, 1996, which morphed into De Morgan Information Security Systems Pty, or DISS, on 17th of December 2001, and Ridges Estate Pty Ltd, or Ridges Estate. The 2 companies would link up in 2002, when Ridges Estate joined the Wrights as majority owners of DISS. This represents the first time that Craig Wright would involve a spouse in his schemes, but it certainly wouldn't be the last. In June 2003, the Wrights entered into an agreement with an associate, Michael Ryan, to sell 5% of DISS for an investment of $50,000. But in August, the Wrights resigned, handing Ryan the rest of the shares. Shortly after, Ryan discovered that the Wrights had breached the terms of their resignation by approaching DISS clients and touting for work, with Craig using his DISS email address to confer legitimacy on the offers. Ryan sued, leading to the Wrights countersuing, claiming that they had been reappointed as directors in an August 8th meeting. However, no evidence of this meeting was ever produced, and the pair were banned from calling themselves directors of DISS and contacting DISS clients. This didn't stop Craig Wright, however. In 2004, he was dragged back to court again by Ryan, who accused him of ignoring the judge's ruling and continuing to solicit business from DISS's clients. Ryan cited email records, mobile phone logs, visitor sign-in logs, and invoices Wright issued to the companies in question to illustrate the lengths he had gone to in order to steal the clients. Wright was summoned to a 3-day contempt of court hearing to address the allegations, where he relied on a defense that would become a staple of his legal affairs over the next 2 decades. Other people had access to his machines, so the damning emails and phone logs could have been manipulated or fabricated by a third party. The judge didn't buy this defense, however, and Wright was handed a 28-day prison sentence, suspended on condition that he perform 250 hours of community service. In sentencing Wright, Judge Zell made a comment that, like Wright's defense over third-party interference, was to be echoed down the years. In my view, Mr. Wright's deliberate flouting of his undertaking makes this a serious offense. His lack of contrition exacerbates its seriousness. There is a need to bring home to a contemner the seriousness of his contempt for the purposes of the crimes. These are my reasons for determining that a sentence of imprisonment is required in this case. Wright appealed the ruling, expanding on his argument that his email account had been compromised, but the appeal judge ruled that, quote, the fabrication of such an email by an outsider without this being immediately detected by the recipient is glaringly improbable. It's important to note that Wright put forward no potential candidates for the hack, the start of another pattern that would weave itself throughout Wright's checkered legal career. Wright wasn't finished yet, however. He took his objection all the way to the New South Wales Supreme Court, where, despite his submission of, quote, fresh evidence of a highly technical nature over the incriminating email, his final petition was dismissed. Wright discussed this case during the Granith v. Wright trial in 2022, where he refuted the suggestion that his sentence counted as a criminal conviction. I was given a contempt of court, but this is not a conviction. It's not a crime in Australia. It's not a criminal offense. This is patently untrue. Contempt of court is an offense under Section 24 of the Local Court Act of 2007 and Section 199 of the District Court Act of 1973, and carries, as Wright found out, a maximum penalty of 28 days in prison. Wright went further during the same line of questioning and denied that he had been handed a 28-day suspended sentence at all, before completely misremembering why he had incurred the wrath of the judge. I was rather belligerent, and unfortunately the judge didn't like my attitude. This was probably true, but court records show that it was Wright's utter lack of repentance and the lies that he was accused of telling about the key email that really antagonized the judge. Wright may have avoided jail over the DISS affair, but he was hit with a bankruptcy notice of $425,000 after DISS collapsed in the wake of his legal battle. The debt was brought by Michael Ryan's lawyer, Chris McCardle, who chased Wright for the payment for almost 7 years before the pair finally settled in 2013, leaving Wright virtually penniless. McCardle said at the time of Wright's unmasking as Satoshi Nakamoto in late 2015 that he was shocked to hear of a connection between Wright and the secretive creator of Bitcoin, saying that Wright simply, quote, existed in his own fantasy world and didn't appear capable of accomplishing such a feat. Outside of the DISS debacle, Wright was making strides in his career. His legal issues split a year-long stint with the Australian Securities Exchange, one of the clients he tried to pinch from DISS, where he worked on information security, and 4 years within the IT department of accounting firm BDO Kendalls, October 2004 to December 2008. Wright says he held this position while remotely studying 2 master's degrees, a Master of Statistics at the University of Newcastle and one in International Commercial Law at Northumbria University. saying of his time studying for the former that he, quote, did not put down that I was Satoshi in his application, preferring to remain, quote, just another postgraduate researcher and student. Wright says that during this same fruitful spell, he also worked on further master's degrees in systems development and information systems security at Charles Sturt University in Australia, and a PhD in computer science from the same institution. It seems, however, that Wright didn't complete this course, given that the defendants in the Tulip Trading Ltd v. Bitcoin Association for BSV and Ors case were confident enough to claim in an April 2023 filing that, quote, Dr. Wright does not have a computer science degree. Wright also claimed to have spent 3 years concurrently studying psychology at Charles Sturt, although the results of this vague undertaking have never knowingly been publicized. Perhaps tellingly, Andrew O'Hagan commented on Wright's lack of staying power in the Satoshi affair, which raises questions over his alleged educational successes. Over the following 25 years, Wright would finish or finish and not do the graduation paperwork for degrees in digital forensics, nuclear physics, theology, management, network security, international commercial law, and statistics. It's not a stretch, therefore, to believe that Wright has listed qualifications he hasn't actually attained on his CV, a theory that was backed up in 2024 when Justice Meller considered that, quote, it would not come as a surprise to find that he had also engaged in significant exaggeration as to his degrees and qualifications. The matter was partially cleared up in December 2015 when Charles Sturt University confirmed Wright's qualifications, or lack of them. No PhD in any subject, no master's in systems development, and no psychology degrees. Wright has also in the past claimed to have a doctorate in theology, and has even published the thesis he says led to it. However, he has never named the awarding university, and told The Economist in 2016 that it held, quote, no relevance anyway. These claims do hold relevance, however, because in July 2021, Wright claimed to have been, quote, enrolled in up to 25 university qualifications simultaneously, and to have lost count of how many degrees he had earned. The Economist also revealed that Wright got most of his degrees via distance learning programs and in other cases rarely went to lectures. Wright has been more than keen to regale his social media followers and blog readers with the number of degrees, masters, and other certifications he purports to have obtained, and at the time of the publication of this book, that number stands at over 25 postgraduate degrees and 5 doctorates. As we shall see as this story progresses, there are serious question marks over the authenticity of a number of these awards, and Volume 2 covers serious allegations of plagiarism over more than one dissertation used to achieve these qualifications. In the late 1990s and into the 2000s, Wright began assisting in the development of the earliest online casinos, claiming in 2021 that, quote, all the operations that I was associated with were legally licensed and managed, and they monitored the activities of individuals who might have been addicted to gambling. However, this was the dawn of the online gambling age, so it's highly doubtful that all the platforms Wright worked for were fully licensed, given that many countries simply didn't have licenses for that sort of thing at the time. Indeed, longtime associate Stephen Matthews confirmed as much when telling Andrew O'Hagan about emails that Wright had been reluctant to pass to the author. I know what's in there. It'll be chatter to do with illegal stuff that he and Dave were doing in Costa Rica, particularly around Costa Rican casinos, where they got $23 million of income, and you don't get paid that amount just for doing a security review. Wright also boasted in a July 2018 tweet, referenced in an interview, that he was, quote, proud to have made my first $20 million before I was 30, expanding on this during the Kleiman v. Wright trial, where he said that the money had come from, quote, an IPO back in the 90s, where I had an internet company that I listed. There is no evidence that Wright ever possessed and then lost such a sum, however, with Wright never mentioning the name of the company, for perhaps obvious reasons. Wright claims that the legal minefield of early online gambling regulations led him to request payment in a pseudo-bank called Liberty Reserve. Liberty Reserve was a payment processing platform founded by Costa Rican entrepreneur Arthur Budovsky, who had left the U.S. following a 5-year prison sentence for illegally operating Gold Age, a forerunner of Liberty Reserve. Budovsky launched Liberty Reserve and its own currency, Liberty Reserve dollars, in 2006. Liberty Reserve dollars were pegged 1-to-1 with the US dollar and allowed anyone to move money around without identity checks, using a global network of facilitators to act as off-ramps into real-world bank accounts. Naturally, this became hugely popular with criminals, including child pornographers and human traffickers, who could disguise and launder their income. We will look at Wright's alleged use of Liberty Reserve and the moral implications of his claims later in this book. But the notion that he transacted on the same platform as child pornographers and hackers is interesting, given his later criticism of Bitcoin for facilitating such crimes. 2003, the year in which Wright's battle with Ryan began, saw Wright encounter someone who would end up playing a bigger part in his life when dead than when he was alive. Wright met computer scientist David or Dave Kleiman when the Floridian was contracted to work on a project for the Australian government. During the same period, Wright was involved in developing various software applications related to encryption and security. At this time, Kleiman was a contributor to computer security mailing lists, such as those maintained by SecurityFocus.com and MetsDowd.com, where discussions over cryptography and other computing and privacy issues regularly took place. By this point, the aforementioned early attempts at a digital currency had come and gone, but there was still an appetite in this group for a decentralized currency developed by the people for the people with no government influence. Kleiman was a former soldier who was made paraplegic in 1995 after a motorcycle accident and relied on the use of a wheelchair as a result. His mind was unaffected, however, and at the turn of the millennium, he, like Wright, was working in the nascent online gambling industry. Kleiman's job was to investigate fraud and other issues related to casino transactions, and it's possible that he may have rubbed shoulders with one of the pioneering individuals in the space, Calvin Ayre, who would come to play an even greater role in Wright's life than Kleiman. Calvin Ayre wouldn't enter Wright's life for another 15 years, but much would happen in the meantime to make his assistance necessary, starting with the creation of Bitcoin.